Okay guys, so this PowerPoint video that I've made for you is designed to provide an introduction to the medieval church. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. While you are listening to this video, you need to have your Intro to the Medieval Church worksheet, because as you go through this video, you're going to need to answer some questions on that paper. So if you don't have it out right now, just pause the video, get it out, get something to write with, so that you can answer the questions as you go. Okay, so our essential question for this video is, how was the medieval church structured and how did the church influence everyday life? So by the end of this video, you should be able to answer those questions. Okay, so first, what I want you to do is I want you to think back to what we did a couple of weeks ago when we started talking about the Middle Ages. And based on what you remember learning in our earlier discussions of Europe after the fall of Rome, list some reasons you think Christianity became more important to people. So you need to think back. When we talked about the fall of Rome, we talked about how Rome was like sort of a unifying force in Europe. You know, it provided some structure to people's lives. And when Rome fell apart, we talked a little bit about how that affected people. You know, there's a loss of protection, there's a loss of unity. So I want you to think about those things and think about those discussions and just try and list some reasons you think Christianity would have become more important for people. Okay, so you can pause the video, take a couple minutes, or a minute or so, and write and try and come up with some reasons that you can think of. That Christianity became more important to people. And then when you're done, restart the video. Alright, so now you've thought about that. So what I want to talk about now is sort of, we're going to start getting into kind of the structure of the church. And so for Western Catholicism, and we'll get in a little bit later into why I'm calling it Western Catholicism. But in Western Catholicism, Rome became the center for Christianity. This is where the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, lived. What you need to realize about the Pope is that the Pope is really, really powerful at this time. He's kind of like a king. Like, he has absolute control over the church. And, you know, today, that really translates mostly into religious authority, but during the Middle Ages, because there's sort of a lack, especially early on, of a unifying political force, the Pope becomes, in some ways, a political leader as well. And as we move through the Middle Ages, we'll be able to talk about instances where the Pope kind of wields some of that extra power. But part of the reason that the Pope is so powerful, or a big reason, is that people feel like the Pope controls who goes to heaven. And like we talked about, when people's lives were really hard during the Middle Ages, a lot of them were kind of living for the afterlife. You know, they were trying to do what they had to do in their everyday lives so that they could go to heaven. So if the Pope is the guy who kind of has the final say or the ultimate control over that, that's a big power to wield over people. That's huge. Okay, so that's part of what makes the Pope so powerful. So getting into more of the nitty-gritty of the structure of the church, I've got a little, kind of diagram here for you guys to look at. So I'm going to actually start at the bottom, and at the bottom there's a picture, and the picture shows a bunch of people. And that's because even though regular people aren't necessarily part of the organization of the church, they are still part of the church. Okay, so they're the people that are going to church every day. They're the people that are, being religious, praying, and all that kind of stuff. So they are still part of the church. Okay, so just above them, you're going to have the clergy, and these are what we'd call parish priests. So these are the people that run their local church. And they're the ones that interact the most with people, because they're the ones that say Mass every week or even every day. They're the ones that baptize people, that marry people, that do funerals for people. So they're the most closely connected to the people of the church. Okay? Above them, you're going to have bishops. And bishops oversee a group of parishes, which would be called a diocese. Maybe some of you guys have heard those words before. But a bishop oversees a diocese. So he's above those parish priests. Then above him, you have an archbishop. An archbishop oversees an archdiocese, which would be a group of dioceses. And then above them, you've got cardinals, who are essentially advisors to the Pope. And at the very top, you have the Pope, who is in charge of everybody. Okay? But you kind of get a sense of who is most closely connected to the regular people, and that's going to be the parish priests or the clergy. And you can kind of see how powerful the Pope is. And it's important to realize that a lot of these people who become bishops and archbishops and cardinals, those are people that probably came from wealthier families. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so what else does the church do? Okay, so we know that they're the ones that kind of are in charge of saying Mass and the baptisms and all that kind of stuff. But what else do they do? And they actually do a lot. They're a center for education. The clergy of a community are usually the most educated people in the community. They're the ones that actually are the learned people in the community. And they also tended to run schools and things like that. They also preserved literature. So at this time, in order to have a book, someone had to hand copy a book. You didn't have any kind of computers to print stuff out, or you didn't have the printing press yet. So if you wanted a book, someone had to hand copy the entire book. And so usually people that were a part of the church, priests or monks or someone like that, they're the ones that would copy those books. So they kind of preserved that stuff. So that was really important. They also established hospitals, and which was really important to people, because if they were sick, that's where they went. They went to the church. Those were the people that were somewhat educated, and even if their medicine wasn't as advanced as it is today, it was still something. And so they're the ones that kind of ran the hospitals. They also were leaders in agriculture. They came up with new ways of raising crops, of breeding animals like cattle, of cultivating fruit. So they really do a lot of things in society. They're really, really important in society. So they're religious leaders, but they also do all these other things as well. And then finally, what makes the church so important is the kind of power it holds over people. And the first thing I want to talk about in terms of how powerful the church is that the church has the power to excommunicate people. And excommunication means not allowing someone to be a member of the church. Since the Christian church was central to medieval life, that was sort of like removing someone from society. So that's huge. So not only are you removing someone from society, but you're saying they can't go to heaven. Which again, I talked about how powerful the Pope was. A lot of it comes from that. Determining who can and who cannot go to heaven. So that's a huge power that the church has over people's lives. And then another power, sort of similar to excommunication, is interdict. And interdict is closing all the churches in a region and preventing priests from performing marriages, funerals, or other services. And basically, an interdict is like excommunicating an entire region. And usually the reason that an interdict would get put on would be done to a place would be if someone who was noble or an important member of a certain town, if they did something against the church, then they might excommunicate the entire area, meaning issuing an interdict. Okay? So at this point, we've gone through kind of the structure of the church, and we've also gone through the things that the church does for society, and also the power that the church has over people. Okay? And those are all really important to understanding how influential the Christian church was on people's lives at this time. So I want you to list 3 reasons the church was so powerful during the Middle Ages. Okay? So you can take a minute, pause the video, and do that. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about is a split that occurs in the Catholic Church. So I'm going to go over a little bit of information, and then you guys are going to do a quick reading on this split in the church. So earlier, I was talking about the Western Christian church. Well, now I'm going to kind of explain why. So if you guys remember back to when Rome was kind of starting to fall, but it hadn't quite fallen yet, there were some emperors that tried to save it. And one of those emperors was Diocletian. And the way that he tried to save Rome was he split it into 2 halves. All right, he split it into a western half and an eastern half. And when we discussed the fall of Rome, we were really talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire actually continues to live on, even after the western half of the empire falls. And what it lives on as is it becomes called the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire had a capital at Constantinople, and it was a major center of trade, and it was also a place where there was sort of a blending of East and West cultures. And if you look at the map on this slide, and you can see Constantinople just above where it says Byzantine Empire, you can kind of see that that Constantinople is sort of where Europe meets Asia. And that's going to be really important because in Asia, you've got lots of other stuff going on. You've got China, you've got Japan, you've got, India, you've got all these other cultures that are in the East. And Constantinople is sort of where those two halves meet. So the Byzantine Empire continues on after the fall of Rome, partly because there's so much, because it becomes that center meeting place between East and West, there's a lot of trade and things that happen which allow it to continue to survive. Okay, so now the church piece of all this. In the Byzantine Empire, there's sort of a different type of Christianity that evolves. In the East, the Byzantine emperor was the head of the church, whereas in the West, the head of the church is the Pope. And in the East, the head of the church being the emperor, he appoints someone called a patriarch, who's the highest ranking church official. And that's kind of like the way the Pope is in the West, but the emperor is above them. And the Byzantine Christians reject the Pope's authority. They don't see him as being in charge of them. Okay? So, and this is kind of important, and it's going to be important later on when we get to something called the Crusades. But it's just important for you guys to know that there is a split in the church and that there's kind of two brands of Christianity. They're both Christians, they just follow some different rules. And just some general differences between Eastern and Western Christianity that are continue to be differences today. In Eastern Christianity, priests can marry, whereas in Western Christianity they can't. In Eastern Christianity, there's more of an emphasis on Easter as the major Christian holiday, whereas in the West, Christmas is the major Christian holiday. And in the East, Greek is the main language of the church, and in the West, Latin is the main language of the church. And those are just some differences, but those things continue to be differences today. Okay, so at this point you should have filled out your entire worksheet, and you should be ready to move on to the reading about the split in the church. All right, thanks very much.